listening mind. I'm your host Sagarika, and today I have a very exciting guest with me. Akshobh Giridharadas is based out of DC. He's a visiting fellow at the Observer Research Foundation (ORF), and he's a specialist in India-US relations. Akshobh, namaste and welcome.
Thank you for having me, Sagarika. It's a pleasure to be here with you on this cold Saturday morning here in Washington.
All right, thanks for joining us. I know you had to wake up early, but that's a weekend well spent for me.
That's
But
okay.
anyway, yeah, I got mine. Um, so, Akshab, without further ado, I'd just like to begin with a very broad question about US-India relationship. There's a lot of outrage on the commentary front, but I think behind the scenes, there's a lot more stability and good news when it comes to the relations. So, if you could tell the viewers what you think of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Sagarika, hitting the high notes right now. It's been a flurry of visits from senior ministers. I think it started off as early as September with Minister Goyal, the Commerce and Industry Minister, this time making a visit to the West Coast over the traditional Eastern Coast cities of New York and Washington. Of course, he came for the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Ministerial Meeting, which saw 14 participations, including Minister Goyal in Los Angeles. India, of course, has come on to the IPEF, which of course has synergy with other Quad partners in US, Australia, Japan, and a lot of partners in the Indo-Pacific, a key focus for both Washington and New Delhi. And then, of course, after that, we had Foreign Minister Jaishankar leading the UNGA delegation in lieu of the Prime Minister coming. The Foreign Minister was the senior most person here. And then, of course, after New York City, where he had tons of bilaterals on the side, comes down to Washington to meet his counterpart, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, and several other, members of cabinet, such as Gina Raimondo, Secretary of Commerce, as well as meeting think tanks and industry bodies like the ones I work for. I think overarchingly now we've gotten Minister Puri in town as we speak. The SCEP, the Strategic Clean Energy Partnership, is taking place. Where Minister Puri is meeting his counterpart, Secretary Jennifer Granholm, who was former governor of Michigan. That's another synergy in energy to use a rhyming phrase there. And of course, to top it all, we'll have Finance Minister Sitaraman in town as we speak, as she's going to come for the fall level World Bank IMF meetings. So it's a bit of flurry visits. It's almost like, the Prime Minister couldn't come this year, but we've had several high-level visits. And of course, this follows up from the earlier meetings this year on the 2+2 meetings that we had in Washington, D.C., and we had the second in-principle Quad ministerial meeting that happened in Tokyo. So we are following up on various parts on that. I think where the India and the United States friendship is right now, looking at the tea leaves on both sides, the joint statements coming out both from the Ministry of External Affairs and the State Department, it is India-US ties have never been more robust. Of course, there are lacunas that can be worked on with every relationship. There's, I think since last year, we're coming up to 1 year of the Trade Policy Forum, the restart of the Trade Policy Forum, I should add. That had a bit of a hiatus with, I think, Suresh Prabhu and Lighthizer were the last two who had a meeting, and in 2017 and then in 2021, Minister Goyal and met his counterpart, USTR Rep. Catherine Tai. And since then, we've seen progress on the trade front. Of course, we are far away from a trade deal, but that, of course, will take its shape in the course of a couple of years. And I think while we work on those lacunas, there are obviously the issues that India and the US are jointly aligned on, that is a free and open Indo-Pacific, and various issues with the Quad. And there's obviously the 2+2 ministerial between the foreign and defense representatives on both sides to work on a high-level strategic engagement. And, I think the elephant in the room, of course, has been the Russia-Ukraine clash, which is, I wouldn't say brought India and the US on different sides, but perhaps highlighted different approaches to the conflict and where each country has voiced their concerns, and rightly so. So that's where I'd kind of leave it there, and happy to take the conversation forward.
I actually have so many questions to ask you based on that. Now, the lacunae are more obvious to the commentariat, right? You know that social media as such functions on outreach, and a lot of this outreach gets written into op-eds, and it's a vicious cycle of information, misinformation, mistaken opinions. So that is that, and that sort of gives the impression, considering the US sort of patronage of Pakistan at this point, and at least one country that India cannot have very very diplomatic euphemisms about is Pakistan, but the US has offered a lot of patronage with Bajwa, General Bajwa, going down and affording a lot of honors to him recently. Now, that might have to do with that intel sharing uh, initiatives at that end, but it tied with recently issued travel advisory to Kashmir, Indian Kashmir, is and there's a few ongoing issues, right? When it comes to our foreign minister also making certain comments when in your town recently about a publication also that is published there. Look, these are all commentary, and these are all the very small lacunae, I would say, because right now, like you listed, there's a lot of good stuff, and there's a lot of robustness that I think is something that is missed out on,
Yeah.
especially due to the geopolitical conflict in Russia, Ukraine. So, my question, I think, at this point is strategic autonomy. That's always been our first of was non-alignment, and I think a more a revised version of it is strategic autonomy.
Yeah.
How do you see that being understood in DC?
No, thank you for that. I think one of the biggest misconceptions that happened after India's abstention at the UNG and the UN Security Council vis-a-vis the crisis in Eastern Europe between Russia and Ukraine was, is there a return to non-alignment, where like the smaller states are. I think it's very important to understand why non-alignment. If you could go back in history just briefly, why non-alignment was important. And I think I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of my friends who are in state and DoD. Even during my academic time, they're like, "Oh, but why was India on the wrong side? Why was India on the Soviet side? Why not on the American side? Did we not have to back Pakistan on that?" Fundamentally, the Nehruvian school of thought at that point, and you have to understand the thing about history is. History is always based on the known knowns and known unknowns. It's the hindsight fallacy comes in assessing. It's brilliant for us when we ruminate and think about our op-eds. But back then, in the Nehruvian school of thought, non-alignment, and the first few leaders were all obviously from the emerging market world. Nehru from India, Sukarno from Indonesia, Gamal Abdel Nasser from Egypt, Tito from Yugoslavia, Kwame from Ghana. What was the school of thought? It was for emerging markets and newly decolonized states to have their own independence of foreign policy and thought. Um, for India, in the psyche of India, 190 years was spent under British colonial rule under the British East India Company. So from that point of view, it was not going to trade one set of Western faces for another set of Western faces. That was American consumerism and corporatism. And don't forget, in 47, 48, and we're going up to the 70s and 80s, there was still a Fabian school of thought that socialism and states like India, which could have thought they could have a centrally planned economy, planning commission, would look internally facing, and foreign policy was never a priority. And you get your own house in order before you go out anywhere else. So the idea then was to create, and of course, the world was just coming off the ruins of World War II. It's seen the nuclear weapons used, and as the Cold War was taking place, and that time no one knew which side was going to emerge on top. So for non-alignment was, in its kernel level, meant for independent states to not be part of what I say a Manichaean duopoly, that this side or that side, and let states focus on the independent thing. But of course, in the Western psyche at that time, non-alignment meant like anti-Americanism, and of course, non-alignment today, in perhaps some way in the emerging market world, a sense of anti-imperialism also meant anti-Westernism, because all the colonial masters were from the West, right? Yes, of course, Imperial Japan had its sense of occupation in Southeast Asia and China, but not the same way you've seen with the Crown and the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the Belgians. So for a lot of time, but what really the fissure started happening in the late 70s is one or more side, or early 70s. Well, like in the Nehruvian school of thought, that's where it was. But of course, in India's psyche, when 62 happened with the war in China, Nehru actually turned to Kennedy for aid. And the US was going to provide aid because, of course, at that time, communist China was, this is before the détente with Nixon, was, seen as a Soviet ally, was seen as anything antithetical to the American idea of what economic prosperity looked like. And before aid came, of course, the ceasefire was signed. India, of course, lost a lot of land and came out bloodied and battered on that side of the war, having lost Aksai Chin, which still is very much under Chinese PLA control. And today, since then, in the 70s, of course, because each side kind of looked at what really they needed, of what each side needed for their own thing. So in the 70s, as relations between Nixon and Indira Gandhi hit a nadir, as Kissinger, former Secretary of State, and Nixon used a very, very coarse, choice language for Indira Gandhi. That's all very public and declassified. You know the words I'm talking about. And of course, it's no secret that Nixon was very close to Pakistani military dictator Yahya Khan and backed Pakistan and in the war in 1971. And that's very well documented in Archer Blood's blood telegrams when he was Consul General in East Pakistan and speaking about the war crimes committed. And the United States threatened to send Sixth Fleet, and that's when India and US relations were at its nadir 50 years ago. And at that time, obviously, Indira Gandhi and her psyche obviously signed with the Soviets and, the Soviet friendship. And so at that stage, non-alignment didn't look like non-alignment. It looked more in the Soviet camp, and India veered towards it. And that's very evidenced in India's military structure today, right? In terms of the MiGs and the Sukhois and just SIPRI would estimate 50 to 60% of India's defense procurement is still Soviet era. Some would say high as 70, 80%, but maybe the more accurate amount is close to 60%. And since then, relations were there. What really changed the India, and of course, just a brief point to that was in 79, I think Anwar Sadat, his predecessor Nasser was non-aligned, and Anwar Sadat signed with Americans because, thinking about the Suez crisis that happened. And so non-alignment didn't look like non-alignment because at the end of the day, tiny states and fledgling economies needed larger states for either, in India's case, more military modernization, because there was the overhang of the China war. There was 65, with Pakistan 71. States' vulnerabilities were in India's case, it was militarization, that military aid needed from the Soviet Union, and in for a lot of other states, maybe like in Egypt, they needed each one turned to one of the other superpowers. And I think what really has obviously changed when people need to look. We recently published a coffee table book on 75 years of India-US relations, and I had a good time working on it. But what really people need to understand more than 75 years, what really the India-US relationship started was 1991 because of the reforms. And I think what really happened is India kind of took off the Soviet shackles and, created the generation that you and I are part of, the millennial generation. We kind of, in South Africa, it's called the born-free generation, the one that saw post-apartheid. But we kind of saw the evolution of India's time, from the Doordarshans to the multiple cable channels, from color TV, from seeing megaplexes, malls, and being able to afford all foreign vacations and forex coming in, and Fortune 500 companies coming in, and and I think that obviously meant two things. One is it meant an economic allure for American companies to come in and invest in India, and a burgeoning market of 1 billion people. And I think secondly, what really accentuated that relationship was also shared democratic ideals, and that's what I would say in the 90s. But I would say today, if I had to round up this point, the India-US relations, I would think about it as a three-legged stool. It stands on, there's the strategic partnership, which encompasses, what my day job would always talk about is the defense relationship, which we've had, the trade relationship that we had, military exercises that, it's part of defense, but, and of course, on foreign policy and alignment on certain issues. There is, of course, the shared democratic values, right? We talk about the world's oldest democracy, world's largest democracies. Both the constitutions start with "we the people," which, of course, in the Indian constitution was inspired by both the French constitution and the American constitution. But thirdly, I would say what's really, really, really influenced the relationship is the role of the diaspora here, right? The ubiquity of the Indian diaspora, right? The ubiquity of the Dr. Patel, the spelling bee champion, the Silicon Valley CEO, right? We were not around in the 70s, but we kind of know what India's reputation in the world was. We kind of know what India's reputation in the West was. It was a sense of archaic colonial era mindset of not just America, but generally in that. And I think Tarur has a very good analogy where in Schiphol Airport, a liberal arts friend of his said, "Oh, you're Indian, please help me fix my laptop." So you went from those archaic notions of what India was like, this land of depraved poverty, the slumdog millionaire caricatures, which of course was one travesty, won the Oscars, but that topic for another day, to this thing of IT, this thing, as as Prime Minister Modi, I think, said in his Madison Garden speech. People ask about, are you a land of snake charmers? He said, well, I don't know about snake charmers, but we control the mouse, referring to the computer mouse and the IT, this thing. And you see that with Shantanu Narayan at Adobe, Satya Nadella, Sundar Pichai, Parag Agarwal at Twitter. And I think that diaspora role has obviously had a positive in the Indian imagination in the United States, and we've seen that right now in the public sectors here. So I think that evolution of thought has really helped move the needle on the India-US space to the point of a very, very, and obviously when COVID hit, one of the biggest losses was 4 billion. The estimated GDP for US universities across around 4 billion, which is a large number, and a lot of that comes from Chinese and Indian students. So even right now, the highest amount of H-1B applicants are Indian tech workers. One of the highest constitutional F-1 student visas are Indian students. So,
You're going to very, very difficult territory for yourself with the H-1B visas now.
of course, I am. Yes, I always do that. But continue.
Right. Look, I'm going to throw a spanner in all of your good thoughts about the relationship with a few questions, let's say, but I'll also bring up on screen something. I'll try to do that. So you mentioned some history.
Yeah,
So, when it comes to a certain, let me just bring this up. When it comes to, India taking non-alignment, this is something that is also true. The US patronage to Pakistan is very old, very
yeah,
expensive for the US, and it has been completely unhelpful to Pakistani citizens and only encouraged terrors. We can't forget that the CIA handed Pakistan $10 billion to then go and create the present day Taliban.
of course.
And those things have been ongoing. So, in that sense, it's not been particularly positive from the Indian perspective initially as well. So, that's one thing. Another thing is, when it comes to India being more towards the Soviet side, that also comes from, of course, like you said, the US did take the first step with Nixon and Indira Gandhi, and there wasn't really any place for a fledgling economy to go except to align for some strategic reasons. Now, why my question was that this whole idea of with us or against us is not particularly prudent foreign policy in a non-unipolar, let's say multilateral global order. It's not there yet, but we do see it changing from a unipolar world order, and as such, having this sort of an attitude where strategic autonomy is actually not something that's discussed in any sort of it's not explained at all from the US perspective. There is just the US. There is and I appreciated our external affairs minister actually calling out the US obsession with Russia being pathological, because the Soviet was a communist government, and at that time it was understandable that their policies would be completely contradictory. Currently, presently Russia is not so. What you have one commentator talking about communist tendencies, and with Merkel, being from East Germany and then having some sort of Russian tilt at one point. And then you have the other side talking about Putin's wanting to expand and become the Russian empire, restoring the older glory of the Russian Empire. So it's a very confused commentary on many spheres when it
Yeah,
comes to U.S. understanding of national interest for other countries. And India has grown economically since a lot of the history that we are discussing right now, and as such has a little more say in its own policy making. So I mean, we always did, and like you mentioned, the ghost of colonization does loom large. The specter
yeah,
of colonization does loom large on any previously colonized nation, and as such, India would want to stay away from that. And I think strategic autonomy is a slightly more evolved version of non-alignment, because there were two blocks and you don't align with either. Right now, it is clear and very obvious lookout for its own national interests. That
of
is
course.
that is the thing, and this sort of idea is somehow not visible in a lot of US policy making, a lot of US official statements, whether it's Antony Blinken or anybody else, honestly. Even Lloyd Austin, our dependencies when it comes to military are actually at the lowest right now under the present government. It's at the
Yeah.
lowest on Russia as it has ever been. And I think now they've, after castigating India about their dependency on Russian military and then not offering technology sharing uh, deals with India. Now the US has gone to blaming us for oil, which, a developing country has its own energy needs, which we are not self-sufficient in, and we have a population whose poverty is brought
Yeah.
up in convenient conversations, but is forgotten when it comes to
Yeah.
our need for energy supply.
Right.
So yeah, I've brought up all of these points for you to sort of address.
Yeah, I think we're gonna clean our days and be here for 10 hours trying to dissect all of that. But let's as I said, I was much to the chagrin of my podcast partner. I always try to say, let's do start at the beginning. A good place to start, the Julie Andrews School of Thought. Let's do this. Let's do, okay. So the US-Pakistan relation. I think it's one of my favorite topics apart because I think you can't just study US-India relations without the context of Pakistan, right? It's largely for longest time it has been US-South Asia relations to really understand the context of that, and I think we have to go back to the Dulles-Eisenhower era. It's well noted that during the time when Eisenhower was president and Dulles was Secretary of State, there was a very good story where Walter Lippmann, the famed journalist, was having dinner with John Foster Dulles, the then Secretary of State. The International Airport in Washington D.C. is named after him, so it's very problematic in more ways than one. And Lippmann asked Dulles very famously, Foster, as he was known, why do you have Pakistan in Seattle? Seattle is now defunct, and East Pakistan was Bangladesh today, barely even in Southeast Asia. Closest was Myanmar, but why do you have Pakistan in Seattle? And Foster replies very confidently, but very stupidly at the same time, saying, "Oh, the British tell me the Gurkhas can fight, so I need them." So Lippmann does a double take that made no sense. He's like, "What?" He said, "What do you mean? What do the Gurkhas have to do with Pakistan?" He's like, "Oh, because they're Muslim from Pakistan." And Lippmann's like, "What? No, they're not." He said they're from Nepal. He's like, "At least they're Muslim, right?" And he's like, "No, they're not." So that it just shows you the level of understanding at that point, right? I mean, I know it seems just it's very convenient to put this little story to that kind of flips the flip to why foreign policy was there, but fundamentally India was non-aligned, and to really understand Pakistan foreign policy, then people need to look into the works of a Pakistani Parsi diplomat named Jamshed Markar. He, of course, one of Pakistan's first diplomats, and and of course, Karachi was like Bombay, right? It was a very cosmopolitan, vibrant city, and the Parsis were a very engaging community. So, what the Parsis are to Bombay, there was a lot of Parsis in Karachi as well, which is why Jinnah, who had a house in Bombay, left and moved to Karachi. He saw the vacuum which India was going to eschew from in not aligning, and Pakistan, of course, needed it, and he jumped on that. And of course, as we know with Pakistan, it's good to see alternate history sometimes. Like, what if? Because Jinnah, as much as there's a sense of ad nauseum rivalry in India, certain circles in India, to what the Nehru Gandhi dynasty has been. But Nehru at that time, in some ways, had built some institutions. I think you have to look at everyone in the pros and cons. Right? There was mistakes on Kashmir done. There was a sense of Fabian socialism, which perhaps at that time was right, but the wheels could have come off, and Indira Gandhi's daughter took it to another level with the license Raj, which it's almost made corruption endemic in the political spheres that we have today. But at that time, Nehru helped codify a lot of this institution that we have in terms of IITs and IIM being trailblazing institutes in the emerging market world. Because in the idea of the Western imagination, there was nothing called India. I mean, we know about what a flagrant racist Churchill was, but the one thing that Churchill said that perhaps could have been true was, oh, India is barely a country, it's a continent, because it was an amalgamation of ideas. Like, why didn't India balkanize at a time where India had rampant poverty in the 60s, 50s, 60s? It had every problem known to mankind. It had wars in 48, 47, 48, plus 62, 65. It had all of that. And in a lot of ways, I think the initial foundation in terms of the fact that what Pakistan didn't do in terms of removing the land laws, and the fact that there was new state recommission added, so no longer Madras presidency, no longer united provinces, and looking at individual states and giving states autonomy in the federal structure that we often forget we have, making sure that Hindi is not But again, much higher, and Hindi is not the national language. Every state has language, because we've seen Hindi chauvinism and how it alienated a lot of the South, and how it, and in a country like India, where regional parties have a lot of sway, and you have to Game of Thrones your way to having alliances to win elections. I mean, at least till 2014, that was, you needed this, you drop alliances, and things, governments fall. What kept India united, right? It's in the European context of nation, there was one religion, one language, one enemy, right? And Ram Goa writes a lot about this. The British had English as the language, they're Protestant as faith, and the French were the enemies across English Channel. And because the British were the enemies, the French were Catholics and they were French, and and Pakistan follows that notion, right? One language, one religion, one enemy.
Yeah.
We didn't have that. Like, and even within certain states, there's difference between the Tamil Brahmin community and the Tamil Chettiar community and the Muppanar community, and within Punjabi Sikhs and Punjabi Hindus. There was what keeps India united in all of this. And I think at that time, India's vulnerability and in some sense of institutions that, and a sense of cultural civilization that we talk about, that fact that anyone in India can have their own story and relate to India, in the sense is, no one in any part of India has never really felt Indian. Yeah, of course, they have had umbrage with the Indian state in some ways, but someone in Assam has a sense of heritage. They can claim that, no one ever never felt Indian, right? Like, I mean, but
Think again, I had sorry to cut you off. I'd written about this early, some time ago. Actually, it was in the context of Hinduism, but for the most part, I think a lot of historians also get this wrong, that after independence is when India has an identity as India. But as Bharatiya people, as people of Bharat, we have a history spanning millennia, right? And there were pilgrimage spots that were patronized by kings, and it was designed so that people from Kashmir would go to Kanyakumari and feel as Indian as ever. That is something that, if we go further back into history, it's something that Indians know it's very inherent to the Indian psyche as such, that you don't need all of these later labels and conversations and dissections and discussions are okay for academics and Western thought leaders who have to dissect it in a way that they understand. Like you said, that each country is very homogenous in its outlook and its behavior. Pakistan is very similar to how Britain or France or
yeah.
even the US thinks of themselves. And India has a history much longer than any of these modern nation states, right? Modern day nation states.
No,
It's
absolutely.
high time that the West comes to terms with it.
Uh, I think yes, but no, in the sense that you're right. India obviously is a civilizational country, like China, like Iran, Russia. There's antiquity galore, right? And we talk about, and this would be a good segue to come back to what we're talking about US-Pakistan relations, because Pakistan, my mom, more of a historian, and had this phrase saying Pakistan was more viable as a notion than a nation, right? Because what the idea of Pakistan was, written by a student scholar, and it gained traction in the 40s, and the Bengalis of East Pakistan right now, as well Bangladesh, pushed it in, of course, in 40 the resolution, and which is why there's a sense of appropriation, right? The sense of appropriation of Muhammad of Ghazni and Muhammad of Ghori, and there was a sense of appropriation of Mughal rulers, and I think India never really had the same issue, right? India, because it existed an idea and a concept long before, and the Indus Valley civilization is one of the oldest civilizations. Maybe a little after Mesopotamian civilization. In the Indus Valley civilization existed since 2000, 2500 BC, and India is never, even though the identity of the Indus Valley civilization today exists in Pakistan, and the name India or Hindustan comes from the river Indus, which flows in Pakistan, but it's never been a sense of the roots. Like, India has never had a sense of grappling with it. But I think if you look at Pakistan, because the reason why I was going with the Nehru story was Jinnah died in 48, in October 48, and obviously one would argue that he wasn't as the same, while he was a lawyer in like Gandhi, Nehru, but one would argue that his way of creating Pakistan, given there was a sense of um, you know uh, uh, it's a sense of maybe more individualistic political aspiration more than the viability of protecting what at that time like the Hindus of the Muslims of India did not feel safe and needed their own country. But if you think about it, when that happened, immediately Pakistan went into political turmoil shortly. Liaquat Ali Khan, the first prime minister, was assassinated. And within a decade, you had Ayub Khan. And I think this is where I wanted to go back to US-Pakistan relations, because Ayub Khan was British educated, Sandhurst, which is the British Royal Academy, and very prim and proper and tall gargantuan land, and he knew how to woo the Americans. And don't forget, at that time the US, the Washington, just saw the world as this, as in the Churchillian phrase of iron curtain spreading, and you need a new state to come on board. And Pakistan sang the song, spoke the game, and lo and behold, as India being non-aligned, there's a, from a Western perspective, that time Pakistan did a lie, and the F-16 toys came in. What we're seeing now, that was a legacy era thing. So that started coming in, and of course that got accentuated even more so in the Nixon era with Yahya Khan, and even at times when the US remained slightly neutral in '65 with LBJ there. But Nixon pushed the needle to an extent, and then of course in the Reagan era with the Mujahideen, with the Soviet-led invasion in Afghanistan '79, what we all know, an innocuous congressman from Texas named Charlie Wilson suddenly comes to the forefront and becomes this, the reason why Afghanistan today is still grappling with the issues of the Taliban. You get a bunch of warlords from all parts of the world and put them in Afghanistan, and you arm them with fancy toys to beat the Soviets. And what happens? The State Department's on the first bus out. So what do you think is going to happen in '89? They're not going to be the good Samaritans who rebuild in schools and colleges and institutions, nation building. They coalesce and they become the Taliban and the splinter groups like Al-Qaeda, which came on. Of course, well, Evans and Osama bin Laden, a Saudi engineer, was one of the first rogue fighters to come to Afghanistan. And even before the Taliban were Pakistan ally, Pakistan had vested interest in Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was obviously far right of center. We saw the assassination of Najibullah, and we've seen US foreign policy in the region, and it's been, you can't look at US India without looking at US Pakistan. Of course, it was not a American duopoly, and we even saw this in the best example of seeing American interests with both India and Pakistan would come in the post 9/11 era, where George Bush, Pervez Musharraf, the last military dictator of Pakistan, played the Bush administration for a fiddle, completely for a fiddle, right? However, despite that, and despite the perceptions of Dabya, as he's known, and Bush was not seen as a very, even though Bush was actually the first president, MBA graduate to be a president. He went to Harvard Business School, but of course his father was president, his grandfather, Prescott Bush, was famous. But what happened there was, during that time, things changed with India as well. Clinton administration in '97 imposed sanctions for '98 for testing Pokhran, but in 2000 made the first visit after 22 years since Carter. But when Bush, there was NSSP signed, and in 2001, 2004, relations, defense sales started growing up. But in '05, '06, '07, as we know, the defense partner, the nuclear deal was the highlight of the India-US relationship that really flipped the scales, because that was the first time the US had signed a major deal with a non-ally. And I think in the Washington idea and consensus has always been this thing of like, you're with us or you're against us, right? And India was obviously very much a strategic partner, still remains a strategic partner, which is why even on the Quad front, Japan and Australia are US allies, India is not. And India is like, the whole notion of Indian foreign policy is friends with everyone, partners with everyone, but allies with no one. And India remains an ally, and India still gets a lot of major India is seen as a major non-NATO part, like gets the preferences of that. And I think that, so what I'm going with this is that the Bush administration was one where you still saw convivial relation with Pakistan, but also saw very like the scale flip with India. And I would say that to rum up that point is, since then, obviously, the way relations have really hit US-Pakistan relations hit a nadir is 2011, when the Bin Laden raid and assassinations, because it was on in Abbottabad outside Kabul Military Academy. Pakistan's very on West Point, and we know how the story goes. And since then, the irony is, in the Bush administration was the last one that hyphenated India-Pakistan, right? Bush would visit Islamabad, visit Delhi, visit Islamabad. But since then, Obama was only president of India twice and didn't even go to Pakistan once. And Pakistan was the only country that that Obama had, that a US president had been to before he became president. Like Obama's had a Pakistani roommate, was familiar with Pakistan, but never visited Pakistan as president. And Trump didn't go there, and it's unlikely Biden's going to go there. And just to sum up, the US-India relation was the Pakistan relation. In the first 50 years, you've had three American presidents visit. That's Eisenhower first in 59, Nixon in 69, Carter in 77. And then since then, 78 perhaps. And then since then, you've had every president visiting. When Clinton came first in 2000, Bush in '05, Obama came twice around 2010, and then 2015 as a Republican Day chief guest. And then Trump even came, even though he's the one-term president, came there. And Biden, of course, it still has 2 more years, so it remains to be seen when he'll come. But I'm sure, given the relations, being where they will visit. On the Pakistan side, look, the reason for Washington to do what it does is, again, every state looks out for own interest. The US-Pakistan relation is not as important as once would have been perceived, given Afghanistan was such a viable base. Pakistan is a viable base given direct US involvement in Afghanistan. The last 20 years, there was significant military presence in Afghanistan. It was America's longest war, overtaking Vietnam, but that's changed since the events of last year. August 15th, what a day. And since then, the relation with Pakistan has changed. And fundamentally, the previous Pakistani Prime Minister, Imran Khan, of course, was very, very vocal, had these crazy theories of conspiracy theories of US involvement, accusing a State Department official. So since then, in American interest right now, they're seeing it's sort of a weird coalition government, because for those of us familiar with Pakistan politics in the 90s, seeing the Sharifs and the Bhuttos only at loggerheads, now being part of the same coalition. So in in America's perspective, it kind of behooves to make sure that, they don't want, no country wants an anti, someone who's anti them. Imran Khan did turn out that way, and they want to test the waters there. And fundamentally, I don't think the F-16s are, yes, the sales of F-16s does worry Delhi sometimes, but for a lot of people, it's just a continuation of the existing deals. That's what the United States has had. And last but not least is, the United States is always keen to engage with civilian governments. Yes, Imran Khan was a civilian government, but there was the notion of being propped from behind, and you've seen the royal treatment that General Bajwa gets, and there is still the military-industrial complex in Pakistan is largely military, less industrial. But and that's where I'd go with that. I think right now the last thing I'd say on this is there are op-eds right now that came out which kind of miss the forest for the trees, because one is you can't overestimate US-Pakistan relations, and you can't underestimate US-India relations.
I look, frankly, for the audiences, I agree with what Akshobh says, because there's a lot of nuance that goes missing. For sometimes that is misinformation, sometimes that is deliberate washing over, and it's all right, because thankfully the actual diplomatic outlets do not actually take op-eds into consideration unless they're very strategic in nature. And there's a lot going on behind the scenes that audiences are not made aware of. However, Akshobh has recently written a very, very articulate article about 75 years of independence of Pakistan and India, and how that's panned out for both countries and where they stand right now. I'm going to link that down. It's a really wonderful read. And for those interested in those nuances, Akshobh also has a podcast on Spotify called The Global Detail, and it's a wonderful listen. So you should go and check it out. I'll also link that down below. Akshobh has a lot more insight into several things, and I'm going to come to a few more of your articles. One you've written for ORF, and another thing that you mentioned previously is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Yeah. So, before I do that, please go subscribe to the channel and share this video if you like it. There are very interesting guests every week, so I hope you spread the word. It really helps the algorithm. Thank you. Akshobh, you wrote
a marketing manager.
I always forget to do this. I think this is the first time I remembered in the middle of a video to tell people to do that, to go like the video. All right. So you wrote about Taiwan, and recently we've seen the US policy on making Taiwan a Porcupine to protect against China. What do you think of that?
So there's Taiwan, of course, is it's actually a good sometimes the case study in the juxtaposition of where India-Pakistan relations can be vis-a-vis China-Taiwan, given that China doesn't acknowledge Taiwan's existence as an independent, we can't even say country, right? As an independent entity, sees as a renegade province. It's called Chinese Taipei in the CCP lexicon. But there's still trade between China and Taiwan, and one that India and Pakistan barely have any trade. But fundamentally, I think what's happened right now is it's been 50 years of U.S.-China relations since the détente, since Nixon, Zhou Enlai's visit, that famous Kissinger trip that happened earlier. But what I think the problem has always been is there's been a one China policy, but a two China diplomacy, right? And Taiwan pretty much exists as a very viable entity of its own. It has a robust economy. It's one of the world leaders in semiconductor. And if you read one of my professor's book, The Chips War, Chris Miller, the Russia expert, but just shows you the semiconductor warfare, and that's where the geopolitics is in terms of your iPhone make and all is all based on, we know about how important semiconductors are. In Taiwan, of course, has the world leader manufacturers. We know about how Foxconn makes a lot of the products there, Micron, Qualcomm, a lot of other companies have significant bases there. I think what really is the concern was we know about how integrated our economies are, how globally integrated supply chains are. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw supply chains were disrupted. What was worrying is where we knew about tensions with Ukraine, and the tensions have been going on since Crimea, the Donbass region. But for many, Putin invaded Ukraine like it was 1939, right? And I think in Washington, that was concerning. It's a human right, it's a humanitarian emergency, loss of lives, not just military but civilians as well. And I think that, of course, brought together that's done a couple of things. One is it's there are escalated energy prices, and sitting in India, what an energy dependent nation we are. We've seen in America, we see gas prices, but in India, petrol prices going up, which of course has compelled India, which is one of the largest importers and energy dependent nation, to procure Russian energy at cheap prices. Secondly, what's done is also created a global food shortage. Russia and Ukraine have some of the largest food when they supply to markets like Turkey and Egypt. And also, what's happened is there is a sense of even sunflower oil that's coming from these markets that were disrupted. And the last but not least is we've not recovered from the supply chain disruption during COVID-19. So what I was going with the story of Russia's interruption with Ukraine is in the Kremlin psyche, Ukraine is very much Kiev predates Moscow in the idea of Kievian roots, the idea of where Orthodox Christianity, the Slavic identity, the Russian Empire begins in Kiev. And Putin, of course, is a very czarist. He, of course, was raised in the KGB school of thought. He was raised, when the wall was collapsing in Berlin, he was a KGB officer in the Soviet mission in Dresden, Eastern Germany. And as he was shoveling his classified documents into a furnace, there was a fire in him that, and he's staring at the fire in the furnace, the fire in him lit, and when he kind of said that the collapse of the Soviet Union, which he said years later in 2007 in Munich, was one of the worst cataclysmic things to happen. But I think where I was going with this analogy has been also parodied compared with China and Taiwan, given the CCP has long seen Taiwan as the rest of province. Tensions have obviously been high on the straits, and the PLA is largest army, and the military might of China is one that few can you take lightly. And I think, given what we saw with Russia, Ukraine, and the fact that Russia, the economy is nowhere near China's, it's far more vulnerable, far more susceptible. Still had sanctions on it from its Crimea. It still did not deter Putin from marching in. You've seen someone like China, and I think there's been I think one of the biggest mistakes a lot of IR scholars got wrong here. If I had to say, there was a contest once this Halloween, you must come as some of the biggest mistakes your profession has made, and we would say peaceful China rise. You've seen under Xi Jinping, there's been the Deng Xiaoping school of thought, as I write, was hide your strength, bide your time. It's a very Sun Tzu art of war thing. Like, as China was, appear strong when you're weak, appear weak when you're strong, and that's not happened in Xi Jinping. We've seen under, and we're coming up to that 20th Congress this year, November. when Xi Jinping has been a decade in power, we've seen militarization of the South China Sea, increasing belligerence with Taiwan, Japan, China, Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands. Even with India, India was a very viable economic partner for China, but China has recently, the commentary would say China has lost India because even after Doklam in 2017, there was a Wuhan summit that Prime Minister Modi went for, and long before COVID was synonymous with Wuhan, there was Modi and
True.
we had that meeting in Wuhan. They had a second summit in Mamlapuram. And I think Prime Minister Modi, if like the way Prime Minister Vajpayee really believed in peace with Pakistan, I think Prime Minister Modi really looked at China's economic synergy because despite unresolved border issues, despite the Makmon line, despite the fact of the Tibet issue, there was still this economic convergence that India had with China as two of Asia's, two of the world's largest economies, but the top three in Asia as well. The belief that, and plus synergy and on the BRICS forum and SCO, that that India and China, despite our political differences, we need economically integrated, which we don't have with Pakistan because there's a lot more animosity on various fronts there. And I think Prime Minister Modi really believed that. You saw in his time when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, he would go to the Guangdong province equally, Shenzhen and Guangzhou, and for vibrant Gujarat, really
Mm.
look at investment from China. And we know about how popular Chinese products were before in terms of Xiaomi phones and TikTok. And I think since 2020, the apple cart has changed. Since Galwan Valley clash, which of course was the first sort of violation we've seen in decades, and not since, I don't think there have been any deaths in 62, but of course there have been little bit of skirmishes, but nothing like the militarization we had in Pakistan. Since then, you've seen India taking a more overt approach with Quad. And I think when the Quad comes in, the AUKUS comes in. But Quad has always been said as not a China pact, economic synergy, not an Asian NATO, but the AUKUS kind of adds a militarization there where India and Japan are a little more hesitant to be part of military pacts. India, of course, is non-ally, so will never try to be part of the pact. But I think the concern is the Indo-Pacific. As if you look at the Quad statements, a lot of it is naming China without naming China, right? Free and open Indo-Pacific, or rules-based international orders, for democracies, shared democratic values. So it's the elephant in the room is always a dragon, as I say, and I think the concern right now was what would that militarization look like with across the straits. And I think for China, the kerosene in the fire was with House Speaker Pelosi's visit, and then followed by high-level delegation visits. And I think what China has been very clever doing is creating blockades, making sure there's investment stifled because semiconductors, Taiwan, one of the world leaders in it, and we know about they discussed about supply chains, about the critical use of emerging technologies, and Taiwan's a very integral part in it. So I don't think this is going to abate anytime soon. I think Beijing will ramp up and try economic strangleholds on it. But if you look at the messaging coming out from the CCP, it's always speaking about this inevitability of Taiwan being whole again. Like in some sense, it's Pakistan's identity with Kashmir, as in it's not complete. Partition is not complete until Kashmir is solved. And in a lot of ways, since '49 and since Chiang Kai-shek ran away to Taiwan, it's that element for the CCP has always been there. And I think it's been it's sort of like a no peace no war situation as we have with India Pakistan sometimes, but the issues of the last few months, particularly with Russia Ukraine, has created a similar analogy there.
I think that's very well explained, but I would still like for you to discuss the US outlook in this and why this is important to us, because I think it's a very US and for a DC-based analyst like yourself, it's understandable. But I find it very American to kind of dissect world leaders with a psychological spectrum that is not often applied to the American leaders themselves, except in terms of creating hagiographies, modern day ones. But apart from that, we see all of these op-eds about Prime Minister Modi being fascist, majoritarian nationalist. We see Putin being czarist, nostalgic, all of that. We see Kim Jong-un being irrational, psychotic, all of that. So there is this tendency which perhaps does not play so much into, I mean, perhaps it plays into policy making, I'm not sure, but it's not something that is common to other nations apart from America to do that, except for American allies. So as such, I will counter what you said about Crimea and then Putin marching in right now, because as said by many realist scholars at this time, they're very famous, with Mearsheimer as well as Kissinger actually being two of the people at the forefront of saying that NATO expansionism would cause Russia a lot of concern, and some of it would be valid. And we can't forget that Russia actually asked to join NATO at one point.
Yeah.
And that was denied. So that was not something that it is sort of deliberate US measures at this time, which kind of ensure that Russia is on edge and will look out for its national security, as well as cannot gloss over the loss of human life and humanitarian crisis that the Donbas region has also previously faced for the last 8 years, which was not covered and discussed in American, policy makers. Output, etc. So, considering what is going on there with NATO intervention, do you think making Taiwan the Porcupine in China is going to have a positive impact?
Well, not really. I mean, I don't think anything is going. I mean, any tensions is never going to have a positive impact, right? Certainly on economically, and that's why I not to belabor the point, but I think to really understand this issue, we have to look at what semiconductor companies are saying, right? Because vis-a-vis what where you're going to see the tensions really take a load right now is because we're still not out of economic recovery yet, and we've got global headwinds on the energy crisis, on disruptive supply chains. And I think given what we saw with how with the virus starting in China, supply chains were disrupted in China and disrupted around the globe. These tensions have been exacerbated with Russia, Ukraine, and will get exacerbated with Taiwan as well. And you've seen right now Taiwanese semiconductor companies, speaking about how they're going to comply with U.S. export laws, and talking about trying to hobble the China chips industry. And I think as President Biden, speaks about trying to make sure that we create, like at the core, one of the things the Quad has done is about creating resilient supply chains, and making sure we will focus on two of the salient features as on the economic side has been resilient supply chains and critical and emerging technologies. That itself has been brought in the forefront with tensions increasing across the straits. So on one hand, there is a sense of Taiwan. There's a new generation of Taiwan that doesn't see, like, the Republic of China concept is it has been present, and I want to caveat, I don't know, I'm not a Taiwanese scholar, so I don't want to get too much into the weed of that. However, there's a new generation of Taiwanese scholars, and I speak to people who are Taiwanese journalists that do have umbrage with the current Taiwanese dispensation as well, because they want to see themselves as wholly independent. They don't see themselves as trying to reclaim that part that the ROC is original. So I think what we're seeing right now, where the Democrat and Republicans do coalesce, is a sense of China as a national security threat, right? Especially on the economic and the tech side as well. What would have said on the American side that changed from the Trump to the Biden era was the Biden administration approached China with small yard, high fence formula. That is, we're not going to go the small yard being, we're not going to have the trade wars that the Trump administration did, and because when the U.S. China had a trade war, it was the tussle of two elephants, and the grass gets crushed. So countries like Singapore, which is open trade entrepreneur, was dependent on both China and the United States. The economy would take a bit of a beating. But the Biden administration said we're going to do a small yard, high fence. In the sense, the approach rather was one where we're not going to have the acebicness of a trade war and publicly spatting with China on global forums like WTO and World Economic Forum. However, there's still going to be a security threat vis-a-vis Chinese tech companies such as ByteDance, Alibaba, and given the semiconductor warfare that's really going to take place right now. So I think where the Democrats and Republicans coalesce sometimes when you look at all the bills coming out is who sounds more hard in China, who comes out harder in China. And I think the reason why we've had this problem for a while is because while fundamentally sacrosanct Ian Pelosi's visit has not changed, it is a one China policy, but there's a two China diplomacy going on because Taiwan is, not part of China. I mean, China sees it as a renegade province as well, and Taiwan has its own identity, and the United States has a large military base in Taiwan. Is spoken about. Biden's spoken off the cuff as well. He said that if China were to intervene militarily, that the US would get involved, but they haven't done in Russia, Ukraine. I don't know if he retracted meant that or was going to retract it later, but that's obviously increased and flared up tensions as well. So I think this two China diplomacy is one that's kind of created more fissures, because when I won't say when your foreign policy is inconsistent, but I think when the nature of the CCP is also changed under Xi Jinping era, right? You've seen a fundamental shift, the Overton window. There is no, iron hand. There's no velvet glove, just iron hand.
Right.
And I think because the nature of the CCP, and there, yes, of course, there'll be a successor to Xi Jinping at some point. Who that person is, what they look like, what their policy are, unknown to us. The CCP, of course, is very closely guarded secret. But as we see the fissures erode in China's own economy, there is still the sense of unipolarity that China has umbrage with. Yes, we live in a multipolar world, but what China has done in the last 10, 15 years is the AIB, because, moving away from a Washington-led institution, since the Bretton Woods systems created the World Bank and the IMF, very Washington-heavy institutions, China now has economic clout to dictate its own terms with the AIB. What the Belt and Road Initiative is doing is to try and, not it's Silk Road formula, right? Like spreading Chinese investments across emerging markets. And if you think about where China sees this is very important. China also is a civilizational country, or a civilizational entity. It's a very, very one of the oldest civilizations in the world. And since the days of the Chinese travelers of Fa Hin, He, and Sang, Tsing, what China sees is a sense of, again, Western hubris that has impinged on China's reverence and sense of respect in the world. And look what the BRI does, right? It tells countries like, say, Iran, saying, hey, we're not the Western powers in the Middle East. We didn't come like the British and the French and cut up various parts and add to the political malice or engineer any coups and beg your pardon. But so we don't care about your political ideology, right? For the longest time, what the American foreign policy said was, if you have peace and democracy, we will back you, right? Like the United States even propped up dictators like Pinochet as well. But when it was convenient for them, right, based on certain ideologies, China, like, we don't have any of that baggage, but you look like you need roads, railways, and ports and construction. We'll give it for you. Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Pakistan with CPEC, Iran as well. I mean, think about countries like Pakistan and Iran. It's a very, very good example of historical umbrage with the United States. We've seen Iran still does not have any relation with the United States in 79, formally at least, and with Pakistan as well, even though Pakistan is still publicly US ally, still has a lot of US military equipment and aid. There's still so much umbrage with the United States. And where they see that with China, with CPEC being one part of the BRI, is, China doesn't come with that historical baggage of imperialism, of the Western hubris of colonization, even though one would call it debt trap diplomacy. Yet they've seen what happened in Sri Lanka. Yeah. So I think that's sort of where the Chinese psyche is at right now.
So it's been called revanchist, and I think that's a good succinct description, and perhaps that is in play. However, do you think that is something that that is for common consumption rather than for strategic policy making? Because it is perhaps looking out for a more maybe it's a cover for internal implosions that it's witnessing in its current economy, and it has been ongoing, at least to the leadership. They're not going to be unaware of things of this scale for, it doesn't come on months in advance, it comes on years in advance. And that has been some news about citizen dissatisfaction. So very often external pot boiling situations are listed as cover for domestic consumption. Do you think there may be that is being portrayed as a revanchist outlook?
Yeah, that's a valid point as well. China and Russia have been revanchist powers. We've seen that with China, as I said, BRI trying to recreate the Silk Road. We've seen that with Putin and Ukraine, given just collapse of the Soviet Union and Ukraine, very, very key part of the Soviet Union and this identity of Russian Empire. There's a concern of that, but the problem with these countries being the way they are in the political leadership, the Kremlin and the CCP, no one really knows how those things work, right? Whereas in democracies, at least publicly, in India and the United States, there's a sense of understanding of, yes, leadership changes and political parties flip over and election unexpected, but there is a sense of method in the madness in how the House votes, how the Senate votes, how the midterms vote, how the electoral college votes, how the Indian Lok Sabha goes to polls every 5 years, and local states election. In the Kremlin's idea, like there's very little understanding of who Putin's advisor is. It's Sergei Shogov, Sergei Naryshkin, Sergei Lavrov. There's a little understanding of who Putin's advisors are, who's chief of, what does he listen to his chief of staff?
Who
Does he
makes
listen
sense?
to, right? Same thing with China as well. Yes, Xi Jinping is the face, but if you look back in 2012, Xi, many years ago, I think there's a new podcast that's come out on Xi Jinping, right from his college days when he was a student here in Iowa or when he'd come on exchange. There's little to suggest that this person had the charisma or the ambition at that time of being where he's going to end up, right? Because I think up till 2012, until Bo Xilai got indicted, he was once a CCP leader, and then Xi found a way to, take flip him over. And if you look at even the Kremlin, I mean, yeah, Putin has been president and prime minister, and Medvedev stood in for him, but it's pretty much Putin's been in power since 5 years presidents: Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden. The thing about revanchist powers, they also have a sense of autocratic outlook about them. And I think with Putin and Xi, there's been that autocratic outlook for the longest time. And even in Pakistan, which has had civilian leaderships in dalliances to military government, there's still, even today, even though since Musharraf in '08, there's not been a military general at the helm, but no prime minister has finished his 5 year term. We literally thought Imran Khan would be the first one. The first time a political party finished its 5 year term was the PPP in 2013, then the PML in 2018, and the PTI didn't finish 5 years. Imran Khan didn't finish 5 years, and 75 years, political prime minister can't finish 5 years. It's a travesty, and we still talk about, we talk about the red carpet treatment Bajpai gets, perhaps more so than Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif. When the Bin Laden assassination happened, we know chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, Mike Mullen, made the first call to Ashfaq Kayani, more than Obama calling up Asif Ali Zardari or Yusuf Raza Gilani. So it's a travesty of institutions, right? Like countries' economies are directly linked to the robustness and the edifice of institutions, right? And how robust they're perceived. And for whatever flaws they may have, the US has had a history of, legal, strong, public-facing institutions, despite the bureaucratic red tape. It has that. And one of the reasons why Singapore, where I lived for 7-8 years, has risen up is a perception of, a very strong government, and it's true, and, effective and efficient institutions. You do have that in China, but it's the control, right? And I think many years ago, if you were to look at countries like China, India, and Egypt, you would have to say the relations, the way you compare them was China has a strong central government, weak civil society. India, I would say Modi had a very weak strong central government, but a strong civil society. And in Egypt's case, they had neither, as it was going through a post-Arab Spring revolution. The countries that can, of course, get close to its strong central government and a very strong society. And I'd say that's why for the longest term, one would have to look at the US as flawed democracy and maybe, but effective enough. And it had a strong centralized system in Washington, but also a federal system across states, and open civil society enough to be able to achieve that sense of economic wealth. I think in China and Russia's case, because it's so nebulous, it's hard to say what the fissures are. Of course, there are fissures. There are enough Russians who are protesting. The Russians are now part of the global economy. It's not the Soviet era where you can hoodwink people and be satisfied with rations at a very low cost. There are Russians who are escaping right now. We speak. There are Russians are fleeing into Georgia, other parts of Eastern Europe, wherever the borders open, avoiding mandatory conscription. As the Russians are eliminated from SWIFT payment and bank sanctions and procurement travel, the Overton window will change. I mean, if the Soviet Union can collapse, if stronger governments can fall, there's no doubt there is umbrage building up in the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg and Vladivostok. Again, in China's case, it's harder to say because the CCP has had its own approach. It's had a capitalism with Chinese characters more
Yes,
than
yes,
socialism characters.
that's true.
It's built a sense of this, and China is not as, I mean, it's good state control, media state control, or internet state control, but there's Chinese are among the most global travelers, so there is, um, we anytime there's protest that builds up, that gets quashed and quelled immediately. So there's no doubt about it. But um,
Sorry, just to, I have a story here. Well,
please,
somebody told me about somebody Chinese who was working with them. And despite them being intrepid travelers, like you said, and they make up most of the a lot of the student population in Western nations. However, they truly do buy into what they are fed because they think that Tiananmen Square never happened, right?
of course,
That's something that the civilian population believes truly. Like until very recently, Pakistan believed that Pakistani citizens often believed that Pakistan won the war with India. Even in Kargil and things like that. So there are these revisionist maxims that they do
no,
attribute.
absolutely, and that happened when there's also a strong sense of nationalism that, and and
Yes.
at that time, if you believe the leader in power, then so look in the case of China, as you rightly said, I'm reminded of a story as well where. In one of my classes in IR school, Dan Dresner was a professor, of course, a very eloquent, articulate professor, and there was someone sitting next to me who was part of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. China, of course, sent some of his best and brightest. Um, and at that point, he said something about Taiwan, and I didn't think he mentioned it as a country, but the framing was like, "Oh, countries," and then something in Taiwan, and I could hear a. And then she stood up and she's like, Taiwan is not a country, just a reminder. And he's like, yeah, but it's still an independent actor, so I'm going to call it that. Or would you prefer I use the term, Republic of China, which of course is more umbrage because the Chinese like to call it Chinese Taipei. And she's like, under whose authority are you speaking on? And he's like, the tenured professor in the US, he's like, I don't need authority. And technically, the First Amendment in the US guarantees immigrants in the US to speak openly and freely. And that was just a reminder because we had this thing called Similex, where we war game crisis. And one of the crises was East China crisis. The six parties involved were US, Japan, North Korea, South Korea, China, and Taiwan. And the Taiwanese students on our listserv sent an email blasting the organizer, saying, "How dare you have Taiwan? Taiwan not a country." And of course, that fueled fire. We had a Taiwanese journalist who was like, "No, no, no, you were just CCP Kool-Aid." And then the Americans chimed in, and some people just posted Michael Jackson gifts eating popcorn. But it kind of just showed the level of sensitivity. And this is a Chinese foreign ministry person. She was in the United States at a top premium IR school, learning an American institution. But of course, she was, committed enough to a cause of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and the Chinese Foreign Ministry clearly has very strong views on Taiwan, as does the Pakistan Foreign Ministry in Kashmir, as the Indian Foreign Ministry in Kashmir, right? I mean, in terms of the views, right? The things that are non-negotiable for a lot of sides, and I think so. That was very evidence that even now that we had to almost say, look, Taiwan, with the military fellows who organize civil, etc., come out and say Taiwan, these are just teams. We're not calling country. There's Team Taiwan, Team US, Team Japan. Like even the South Korean defense attaché at that time, no, I won't say representative of the defense forces, said in the South Korean constitution, North Korea is not a country. It's just seen as an illegal occupier, right? And until reunification, and but we like Taiwan's an independent entity, is a very much independent actor, and they are. This is a crisis, so it was very interesting to see how that played out.
Well, that's a lovely story and I think, very insightful into how countries behave when it comes to their ideological outlook in foreign policy. Akshobh, it's been a pleasure. Honestly, I have a ton more questions, and I'm sure we'll keep chatting offline as well. So thanks so much for joining me today. Guys, if you liked the video, to give it a like, share it with your friends. Do subscribe to Akshobh's podcast as well on Spotify, which I will link below again. Thanks so much for joining us, Akshobh, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks for having me, Sagarika. The pleasure is all mine. Look forward to chatting soon. Bye.